entitled How It All Fits Together, Integrating the Growing Number of Initiatives into Your PBIS Tier 1 Framework. My name is Patti Fetzer, Director of Prevention for the Stark County ESC, and I am joined by Debbi Bailey, Educational Consultant for State Support Team Region 9. Debbi and I are so excited to talk to you about this topic today. We see this work as a game changer. We see this work as transformative. We see this work as making your jobs easier and your outcomes better. Debbi and I and others from the Stark County Educational Service Center, State Support Team Region 9, and Stark Education Partnership began joining forces over a year ago on this topic because we see tremendous opportunities for connecting the dots between PBIS, trauma-informed and resilient schools, prevention education, school climate and culture, family engagement, and equity at the Tier 1 level. We also see the tremendous need to decrease the burden, the siloed efforts, and the confusion for you, our educators. We hear you and we see you. We want you to come away from this session with some simple next steps for your building or district Tier 1 team design and planning. So let's get started. Today's session objectives will be to, number one, identify the benefits of alignment and integration of universal Tier 1 initiatives. Number two, use data to identify which evidence-based initiatives address the unique needs of your district or building and provide a strong foundation for all students and adults. And number three, generate realistic next steps to initiate integration. So we want to start also by giving a shout out to each of you for taking the time to attend this session. You obviously already recognize the importance of this topic, especially after the year you have all experienced. This video that we will show next will give you a great description to support the why. As you watch the video, think about the significant work and progress made through the years in all of our great Stark County schools with the implementation of the care team model. You are doing a great job supporting the growing number of Tier 2 and Tier 3 students you are serving. Take a moment to celebrate those accomplishments. Also, as you're watching the video, begin to envision ways to strengthen your Tier 1, where all of your students, families, and staff can have access to proactive, preventative teaching and learning of basic social, emotional, and brain health and prevention and resiliency skills. Take a listen.
It has never been more clear that we need a new response to meet the mental health needs of our youth. The social, emotional, behavioral needs of students has never been more prevalent in our country, and the need continues to grow. Suicide has gone from the fourth leading cause of death to the second leading cause of death among youth and young adults. 1 in 6 youth experience a mental health disorder, and only about 50% of those youth receive treatment. Lack of student access to treatment leaves schools as informal mental health providers, which is okay because school mental health research says youth are more likely to complete treatment when offered in school settings. The increasing need of our youth and communities makes it time to break down silos of service delivery and focus on a whole population response. Schools have been using a prevention-focused tiered logic known as PBIS to organize and allocate resources to support behavioral needs of students for decades. And school-based mental health has grown during this time period as well, while powerful and more effective to have supports within the schools. Often, school teams and community partners still work in isolation, not knowing the supports the others provide. The Interconnected Systems Framework draws on the strengths of both systems to create one single system of delivery, while also focusing on increasing the confidence and competence of all school staff to rigorously and continuously support the mental health of all youth. Before we provide enhancements to the current systems, we first need to celebrate the progress that has been made. Through the advancements of both school mental health and PBIS, we are at a tipping point where mental health and wellness for all students, staff, families, and communities is a top priority. There is awareness and even support and policy for increasing mental health clinicians within schools. SEL is being prioritized and taught like academics to all students by all staff. There is increasing awareness of childhood trauma and understanding of the impact on learning. While these are huge celebrations, there's still work to be done. Now we need to move our focus to designing our systems to integrate these successes in the most efficient and effective ways. First, we must alter our systems so that we utilize the social, emotional, and behavioral expertise of school and community clinicians on teams who are selecting evidence-based practices together that align with the need of the community, the resources available, and the capacity to implement. Then define one continuum of supports matched to the needs of their students, families, and staff, and use data to drive how students enter and exit interventions, helping move away from a traditional referral handoff approach. Integrated universal teams can focus on prevention by using data to expand and prioritize the social, emotional, behavioral competencies being taught to all youth, and align the skills within systems such as our school-wide matrices to create consistency. Then integrated teams create procedures and structures for routinely monitoring all practices that are put into place to ensure the end result impacts student outcomes. We also must invest in the time, space, and coaching for teachers to embed social, emotional, and behavioral teaching alongside academic content. Sustainable change comes from systems change, and the ISF provides the structure and processes to enable this change to occur.
This next slide provides the visual and a link to the Whole Child Framework that was recently released from the Ohio Department of Education. You will see the many components that support learning and wellness. Setting the table for academics by ensuring that all students, notice equity is at the core, feel safe, supported, and healthy. The wheel includes many initiatives such as school climate and culture, social emotional learning, health education, physical activity, health services, family engagement, staff wellness. Whoa, now take a deep breath. Schools are doing much of this work already, but often in siloed, disconnected ways that might be impacting some students, but maybe not all students, families, and educators. Today will be your opportunity to begin to envision opportunities that strengthen and streamline your Tier 1 efforts, the foundational tier that is focused on what all students need to feel safe, supported, and healthy, ultimately ready to learn. Today, we will help you see opportunities to begin to align and integrate your current and future work to support each spoke on this wheel. Take another deep breath, which is actually a proven, simple strategy based in brain science that helps calm and focus your mind as you prepare for today's session. Brain and learning science research tells us that the brain's ability to focus and comprehend information, to learn content, to perform a task, or even just to do well on a test demands much greater attention to giving both students and adults both tools and strategies to decrease their stress, manage symptoms of stress and trauma that are often outside of our control, increase our health and wellness in areas like nutrition, movement, and sleep, and improve our relationships, sense of belonging, and human connectedness. This is the why. The quote on this slide comes from the attached YouTube video entitled "The Science of Learning and Development" that comes to us from the Learning Policy Institute. This quote sets the stage for our session. The developing brain expresses its fullest potential when effective, cognitive, social, and emotional development are intentionally integrated.
Thanks, Patti. We're going to begin our conversation and frame our conversation about alignment by looking at the definition. Notice at the top of this slide here, it is defined as the proper positioning of parts in relation to one another. And when we think about alignment in an organizational level, it is defined as the simultaneous implementation of multiple initiatives with efficiency and effectiveness. These last two words, efficiency and effectiveness, are the keywords. So you'll notice as we go a little deeper what this alignment and integration really looks like and what it can do for our systems and why it should be considered as we move forward. This pyramid is familiar to all of us as we think about PBIS and MTSS. Just like core instruction in academic areas, we must be thinking about what everyone has access to in Tier 1. Reflect for a couple minutes on the ways that your school or district is using resources to build a strong foundational Tier 1. Active PBIS teams that use the tiered fidelity inventory to continually assess the Tier 1 framework will see the benefits of systems that have been created, and evidence will show that 80 to 90% of all students are supported at this Tier 1 level. That's a lot of individuals. If an increased number of students are showing a need for Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports in a building, we would strongly advise that the PBIS team take a deeper dive into the data and complete a TFI to determine whether there are gaps in Tier 1 practices. This is very important. Now let's take a look at what characterizes Tier 1. What do those universal practices in PBIS look like? Keep in mind, as we just heard, that Tier 1 universal practices should support 80 to 90% of all students, but must be available to everyone. Tier 1 is the foundation that every student receives every day. At this level, the focus is not on individual student needs. Instead, we are organizing overall environments to be nurturing and supportive for all. By taking a proactive approach to student needs and providing all students with education around wellness, we will impact student outcomes and prevent unwanted behaviors, resulting in a fewer number of students needing targeted supports at Tier 2 and Tier 3. And lastly, Tier 1 calls for continuous examination of the practices that are in place through progress monitoring. The PBIS team should be accessing data and making decisions accordingly. Notice that PBIS, by definition, states explicitly that there's an expectation that there's an integration of evidence-based prevention and intervention services and practices along a multi-tiered continuum. So instead of thinking these other behavioral approaches and prevention services are sitting outside of PBIS in silos, we want to emphasize that this is what PBIS is intended to do, to organize these silos into one cohesive system. What are the benefits? Why would we align? PBIS is required to be implemented in all schools, as you know. Recent legislation requires it through House Bill 318, and it has added an accountability measure that districts must report their level of implementation on report cards. There's less duplication, one PBIS Tier 1 meeting, not a variety of meetings that pull everyone in different directions and use a lot of time. Less time and resources. Again, all of the work in Tier 1 is proactive, preventative, and evidence-based. Therefore, the PBIS team can use all of this work to put processes in place to strengthen the Tier 1 foundation, which ultimately results in 80 to 90% of those students being supported by the practices, and resources are used on those more intensive needs in Tier 2 and Tier 3. Better coordination and alignment of efforts. We know that sustainability and efficiency have received heightened attention on the need for effective systems of alignment for very good reason. Stronger sense of community. Integration creates a unified culture with common language and common purpose. Diversity of expertise. Integration at this level means bringing various skills and knowledge together on the team to intentionally support all. It allows for cross-system problem solving too. And progress monitoring for fidelity and impact. We think you would agree that you don't have time to waste. We must make sure that the practices that we put in place are being implemented in a consistent manner, and there's evidence to show that. So when we think about the overarching components of the entire PBIS framework, these things come to mind. Effectively teaching appropriate behavior to all, intervening early before unwanted behaviors escalate, using research-based, scientifically validated interventions, monitoring student progress, and using data to make decisions. The entire framework is evidence-based, as you are aware, and therefore we need to think about using evidence-based practices within all tiers.
Now we're going to walk you through those 3 steps to get you started on your Tier 1 alignment and integration journey. The 3 steps are: step 1, identify the teams and point persons that impact Tier 1. Step 2, complete an audit of Tier 1 practices. And step 3, review data and practice evidence. What is working and what is evidence-based? So now let's just dive in to step 1. So take a moment to really think about who is on your building or district Tier 1 team now. Jot down names and roles if you already know, or write this task down as an action step that you will follow through with after this session. So let's consider that who you may have on the team as you're thinking about that, as you're jotting down some names and some roles. What we know is of required PBIS team members, as we have on this slide, is you would have a systems coordinator, a school administrator, a school counselor, a teacher or teachers, a family member, and some skill sets that really are required on that PBIS Tier 1 team in applied behavior expertise, coaching expertise, and knowledge of student academic behavior patterns and data, and knowledge of school operations. So keep listing who you have on that PBIS Tier 1 team now. And then now, as you think about what could be in the future state, as you think about the integration of your PBIS Tier 1 team to include some of those other features, as we saw on that wheel, thinking about what role, what expertise, what curriculum, what resources that school nurse could bring, who often sits at local state tables gathering expertise. They're also the ones that are often knowing what they're seeing the needs for, whether it's an increase in teen pregnancies. So maybe we need to have some more content on the front end at a Tier 1 level for students, for family planning and adolescent health. Maybe maybe she's seeing an increase in students coming to her with different substance abuse issues or nutrition related issues. And so she or he may have some ideas. Your health and your phys ed and even your science teachers have so much content expertise that is key to wellness, and might have some great ideas to bring forth if you utilize their talents, their curriculum, their expertise, on that team. Think about who is in your district, who's in your building that really has that expertise around diversity, equity, and inclusion to help us think about ways we can be inclusive for all the students at that Tier 1 level. They have a lens that we need to be mindful of. We need to make sure that we have that lens on our team and in our thinking for our work ahead. Your care team, make sure that there is a representative from the care team on this integrated team. They're seeing the referrals come in for that Tier 2 and Tier 3. They can tell you where, for instance, they have seen an increase in vaping that's occurring in the school. They've seen an increase in students that are struggling because of their LGBT. They're seeing an increase in various different areas, different substance abuse areas. They could tell you, boy, if we had some more content where the students and families were getting good information on the front end in a more of a preventative, proactive education way, we could prevent some of these things happening at the Tier 2 or Tier 3 level. And your mental health providers that you already have in partnership also have access to prevention specialists that specialize and could be utilized to kind of say, here are some strategies, here's some curriculum, here's some things you can consider using on that Tier 1 level. You have likely a school climate and culture point person. that, is helping with reports and helping looking at things on a larger level. The trauma and resiliency expertise that's growing within our districts has been growing significantly, even over this pandemic, where a number of our educators have been working towards becoming certified in trauma-informed and resilient schools. So making sure you're pulling them in. You might have a separate, what they call TREC team, which is your trauma resiliency education collaborative team, that might be pulled in as a resource for this integrated PBIS team. And as your districts are doing more and more around family engagement and how do we engage all our families, you might have some different experts that you want to bring to that planning as you move forward. And it's important to note that not all the members, it can look like, wow, that's one big team. They don't all need to be at every meeting. They can simply attend meetings that are relevant to them and that they can be accessed as needed for ideas or guidance or resources that relate to their areas of expertise. So use everyone's time well, but pull in every piece of expertise you have in that district.
Okay, so here we see a visual of a sample structure that bridges the variety of initiatives in a building, just reinforcing, similar to what Patti just shared. All of these fall within the climate and culture of the building, referring to the quality and the character of school life, basically, is the climate and culture. So if we think about how all these could look when they're siloed, as it's represented here, and if we change that to, whoops, diversity didn't leave us, but you get the idea. So this shows the representation of considering point people that might be on the team or might be available to consult with or collect data from or learn new information, or those people that are front line with our students and can tell us that qualitative data as well as quantitative, what we're seeing in attendance and behavior reports and things like that. So we urge you to consider those individuals and what they can lend to the team, rather than having multiple initiatives in multiple areas of social emotional.
And now that your team is in place, you're well positioned for step 2.
Okay, so we're going to think about this slide shows us about resource mapping, sometimes referred to as a program audit. It's a way to identify mental health or behavioral programs and services that exist in all 3 tiers of supports, although for the sake of today's conversation, we're going to focus on tier 1. So this is an activity that can be done with a group that you would bring people together that are those point people to think about everything that is done around social, emotional, or behavioral behavior or prevention and wellness in your building, and list all of those out, and then really have some reflective conversations about what is effective and where the data is that shows the impact that those different practices are having. So maybe it is not necessarily an evidenced approach that you're looking at. If you are listing all of them, maybe you look at one and it's not necessarily evidence-based, which would indicate that it might have to be reconsidered. Is this making an impact? Is it something that aligns to the PBIS framework? Or it might provide evidence that the practice is not being implemented with fidelity. So perhaps there's been staff changeover, there's a need to reboot professional development if there's not data that supports that practice. So this is an opportunity to really look deeper at the data that is available to you and consider whether the needs of your students and adults are being met at tier 1. What's not working and can fall off that plate? Where are the gaps? Can those gaps be filled through the many resources that are available? This would be, in talking with Patti and discussing this activity, we'd like to offer our support. If you attend the unconference session, this is something that we could help you to dig deeper or think about how that activity would roll out in your individual buildings. This is an example these are two examples of this resource mapping or program audits, whichever term you prefer. The Post-its are each representative of a different practice or a different initiative, or it might even be an SEL curriculum listed on there, but practices and programs that these buildings were doing around social emotional. And then they took time to look at each Post-it and determine, is there evidence to support this? Is this giving us the outcomes that we want for students? Is it aligned? Is it proactive? Is it preventative? Is it evidence-based? And is it focusing on teaching students social emotional skills?
So now that your team is in place, and then you have that comprehensive list of all your Tier 1 practices, now it's time to dive into step 3. Reviewing the data and practice evidence, what's working, what's evidence-based, what practices, as Debbie shared earlier, are we simply doing because that is what we've always done, and we can consider maybe continuing a few practices because the evidence is no longer supporting it. So this next slide may feel a little overwhelming. There are so many sources of data, not only in your building, but also available within the community as we're thinking about that whole child. So many things that you can have access to. But what we find oftentimes is that pieces of data sit in different areas of the building with different point people. And so when you have that team that all has different accesses to different data points, you bring them together, you can have access to all that you need to really have a good picture. So for instance, just this year, your districts, each district did 2 different prevention needs assessment. One that was done as required by the Ohio Mental Health and Addiction Services for prevention education funding, and one that was done more recently by your district at the request of the Ohio Department of Education. But making sure you're able to pull that information and look at it together is helpful. All districts have had students go through the Northeast Ohio Youth Health Survey. You have that district information to kind of guide the thinking of and recommendations from that survey. There are various data trend points that you can gather from your building. PBIS teams are used to gathering this data around discipline, but you might not be gathering data around nurse visits. That's checking in with that nurse, that added person you might be adding to this integrated team. Looking at what kind of crisis incidents are occurring so that you can look at how do we begin to prevent it with our Tier 1 practices. Looking at attendance, behavioral observations, what are you seeing at different points in times during the day, at different transitions, at different locations within the building, in different classrooms. And then dig deeper. Make sure that you're looking, as we're thinking of continuing to get better around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Look for areas of disproportionality, different areas of disparities. Look to see if there's some differences and some nuances related to race or gender, language, special education, and gifted. Just to get that full breadth of who's doing well in certain areas and who's struggling. For instance, is if you have a prevention practice that you might have available in curriculum, say for instance on prevention of substance abuse, but if you don't have, or maybe internet safety, but if you're not providing that to the families that English is their second language, that the families have access to that information in the ways that they can receive it, then not everybody's getting access to the information. So it's just really beginning to dig deeper. And then as you're looking at that data and thinking what practices are working and what practices are not working, which ones are now evidence-based and maybe which ones used to be what we thought worked, But the more we look at it against all these other data points, the more we're thinking, you know what, that's more work on our staff, and maybe we need to make a change. It might be a really great program, but you have some implementation or fidelity considerations. There might have been some staff turnover that has occurred, and you need additional training or additional coaching. We all need more to continue to strengthen our skills around different practices that we're trying to implement. And, you know, just continuing to think about what office, team, or point person has access to any of the above or could help you in really analyzing the data and looking at it from a broader perspective.
So we're back to the slide that we saw earlier that looks at those overarching core components of PBIS, but now we're going to look at what it looks like when it's integrated. This slide really brings it all together. Note that each core component is made more meaningful by adding the layer of prevention or behavioral initiatives that already exist, but bringing them into the PBIS framework. For example, this first core component of PBIS, effectively teaching expected behaviors, but now we're going to be looking at this from a whole child perspective, considering the integration of social emotional curriculum and focusing on building social emotional skills of all students, embedding those opportunities to practice the skills within academic curricula as well. So then intervening early to prevent unwanted behaviors is another core component of PBIS. Integration, though, helps us to understand behaviors from a trauma-informed lens, for example, and having an awareness of what might trigger students based on their past experiences. In other words, understanding the need to look at the behavior from a perspective of what is this student really trying to tell us, and what does this child need from us, instead of what needs to be done to this child. Choosing research-based interventions is the third core component of the PBIS framework, but then going a step further and looking at it in an integrated way, using the expertise to choose those evidence-based programs is the expertise of our behavioral experts or mental health professionals that we have access to help make the determinations, and then thinking about which caring adults will implement those strategies and embed those opportunities to practice. Monitoring student progress becomes even more efficient and effective when multiple sources of information are being used from various sources, not singular pieces of evidence. Using data to make decisions is very similar to the core component above. Integration opens up additional data opportunities to make sound decisions.
This quote from Maya Angelou is something that I and some colleagues of mine have been using a lot, both personally and professionally during this pandemic. Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. We know that brain and learning science was not available to us when our education and even the mental health system that I came from was being designed. Though many of us knew intuitively and are not at all surprised by what brain research is finally revealing. But now we do have the science to back it up. We can take time to ensure that our systems support what we know works. We also learned so much during this pandemic that forced many of us to revisit these brain science-based strategies just to calm and focus our own stressed and traumatized minds and bodies, so we can learn and perform as educators in new ways, because we had to in order to survive. So we have that new lens that we're bringing to our work ahead, knowing that so many of our students are struggling with stress and trauma and have been for years, even prior to the pandemic, but we are prepared with more and additional knowledge to support them in the days ahead.
So this slide, we just captured some of the perspectives or quotes that we've heard from recent educators in some various professional development and networking opportunities that we have participated in, and started planting those seeds for integration. So take a minute. There's a couple, we just grabbed a couple that were the most powerful, but these are definitely impactful when we think about where teachers are at and what they see as advantages to this integration of work. Okay, so we promised you in the beginning in our objectives that we would talk about next steps. And Patti and I would like to offer an opportunity to you for to join our unconference session that's part of the High Impact conference here. It's a Q&A, or it's an informal time for processing and networking with one another. So we'd like to offer that. It's going to be happening on June 16th at 2:30. There's the link, but you'll also, I think, receive the link from the administrators, or I think it's in the brochure as well. But in addition to that, we'd also like to offer our individual help if you want a thought partner to think about what this integration would look like in your building or in your district, or what your PBIS team might need to do to take first steps and think things through about how you can start this. So our email addresses are here. We're happy to be responsive. We're both very responsive and excited about this work and feel that it's very valuable. So we're not the experts, but we'd love to come along with you and learn together or talk it through to problem solve. So those are a couple steps that you can take. And we both want to say thank you so much for participating in the session. We wish you well as you move forward and take the first steps to this work. Thank you.